All right, in this tutorial, I want to talk about geolocation in Rails and combining Stimulus.js with it to create more or less a way to one-click your location into a field. Say you need to search a location in your app and you need to input maybe some sort of data from the user's address or current location. And you could do that either they can type, the manual way, or click a Find My Location button that we've introduced here. And this hooks into a gem called Geocoder, which is going to return some JSON response to us and simulate, the address or whatever lookup value you need to insert into the field. So in my case, I want to show you by example. You're doing this, your browser for security reasons will need to enable access so that you have to, prompt the user to do it. And it kind of just does that by default with Geolocation API as part of the browser. We're going to use this getCurrentPosition method, which passes in coordinates and then can be returned to the server, in our case, the Rails app, and spits out, a location based on our gem. So let me do a quick example. You allow it, and it should take a while. Some sort of loading state in this case would be good. I'm in Missouri in the US, so I just did my state to hopefully not disclose my literal address because that's creepy. Don't come follow me. Anywho, let's kick off getting this started. I know that's super simple, but the form itself actually doesn't do anything. But in this case, in a side project I'm working on, I kind of needed to do something like this. And it was just way easier to implement a location field as like a helper. It's not necessarily the only way you should do it. I think you should still allow manual entry on the form, but this is a quick way for people to, maybe they're on their phone or something. It'll just be easier to grab that and then enter the field and go to town, whatever you're searching. So let's kick this off. I could show you the code first, but I think it's good to go in fresh. So let's create a new app. Code directory, I'll say Rails, new Geocoder, just geocode demo, something like that. And I'll say, I'll use Tailwind and ESBuild. So we'll go and do that, create the new app. Now we will need a gem. I'm going to look up the Geocoder gem while that installs. Now this gem can do a boatload of things, and a lot of times you'll need an API access to like Google or something to get the full spectrum. But we're going to do, I think, what's called a reverse lookup based on latitude, longitude coordinates and pass those through. And then that will return whatever data you need based on those coordinates. So it can be very exact. So I'm going to try my best not to disclose where I'm at. Hopefully that doesn't happen, but whatever, I guess. In there, I will add bundle, add Geocoder. And this should throw it in our gem file and fetch it as a dependency. We can go check that if you want to. And I'll go into gem file. You should see it at the bottom. Save that down. It gets the latest version, I think. Cool. I'm on Ruby 3.3 and Rails 7.1.3. I think that's bleeding edge right now. Turbo 8 was just released for some context around timing. So if you see this video in the future, that was what just occurred. Next, we need some sort of way to hook into a form. So I'm going to create just a generic search field. This will be our start page, that infamous Rails logo there. And what I'll do is generate a scaffold or generate a controller. So say generate controller, and we'll call it search. I'm going to just put an index action on that search, and that should generate what we need to get started. So I'll go back in there. I'm going to actually adjust the routes. And I'll actually, one more step before I do that. I'm going to generate one more controller. That's going to be the function that creates the search response. So when we submit the form, I want it to go to an endpoint, and that endpoint is going to be what goes to our Geocoder gem and returns that JSON I talked about earlier. So I'll say controller, and we'll say search location, and then I'll do a create action because that's kind of the convention with Rails, the RESTful routing. I like to kind of, if I can, create a new controller for that specific use case if that's all it's going to be, rather than bury that in some other controller just because it's tangentially related. A lot of times it's easier to find and understand when another developer comes along. If you do that, you kind of separate concerns, make it thinner controllers, but still a little easier to understand, I think, in the long run. All right, so our routing is important here. So let's go to routes and update that. We're going to keep one as search index. I'm going to get rid of this get for that search controller one. I'm going to actually route to, let's see, search index. Okay, and we can keep that route there for the get, but in this one we want a post route. So we'll say search location. And this is we'll be explicit and go to search location create. Since it's a post response, that's going to kind of assume it's going to go to the create action. I think you can maybe get rid of this and still be okay, but I'm going to go ahead and keep it. Now the search form, we set up our root route with Tailwind. It kind of resets everything. So it's just going to be very plain Jane here. In our view, I'll go to the search index, which is our main view we'll make use of, and add a little bit of Tailwind in our form. So max width, XL, MX auto, MY16 to kind of shift everything in the middle and off the top viewport. And we can just say search by location. So this might be something you integrate into another view. All right, and then in here, we're going to tap into some stimulus stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and pre-code what that's going to look like. So data controller geolocation is what I'm going to call it. Inside that div, we're able to capture what stimulus logic we need. So here I'm going to add a form tag, and it's going to be just a basic Rails helper-based form tag. Search index URL. Now you might have some other kind of URL structure based on your routing and if you're using an actual model under the hood, which you probably would be. So that's something to keep in mind as you see my demo here. I don't have anything backing the data when we're doing the search. It's just demoing the geolocator gem. So if you were to do this and actually doing a search, you probably would do something with like PG search or some basic MySQL query that looks for like terms basically based on the inputs and returns it based on some sort of resource you have, whether it's like a post or an article or I don't know, some sort of data. But for our purposes, to keep this simple and short, I want to keep that out of the picture. So here I'll add a text field tag and we'll call that query, and that's what we'll hook into on the controller front once we get to that. Rounded, let's see, border gray 300 with opacity, focus ring 4, focus ring gray 200, 600, or 60 I mean. Then we'll say focus outline none, width full, rounded full, large text large. Will I give it a placeholder? Search city or state. In this case, I'm just going to return a state to keep it simple. You can change this to be very granular though. For this particular one, I'm not going to add any controller to it in this case, since we've got it up here. We've got our geolocation controller, but we do need a target here to target this input specifically. So we could say geolocation target, and we'll call that input. It gives us a way to hook into it in our stimulus controller that I'll make next. Finally, we need a button to submit the form. It's not going to actually do anything, but I want to just give you some UI if you wanted to follow through with that. And we'll affixate this in the actual field so it looks nice and tidy. Could have copied and pasted this, but I find it's better to just type along sometimes. So the border gray 308, shadow small, BG gray 50, 50. That should be on hover. And what do we got next? Yeah, search. All right, let's see what this does. That's a little off because I think we need the relative class to surround that. There we go. So that gives us our form that you saw in the beginning. And then we need a button underneath that that's actually going to be the trigger for our location logic. So this is outside of the scope of the form. Be careful when you if you miss this and put a button in the form, it's going to probably try to submit the form. So outside of it, I'm going to keep it a button. but also just keep it outside, since we still want it within the context of the data controller div, but not within the form, if that makes sense. And then we'll say find my location. And we could just make this a simple link essentially. So we'll say class underline font semi-bold. See how that looks? There we go. Maybe just medium. It's a little heavy. And I'll do some margin on the top to get it a little bit off the grid there. One important thing we'll need here is an action. So data action will hook again into our controller, which will be click. Well, we need to listen for a specific event. So in the buttons case, it's probably going to be a click event, and that will hook into our geolocation controller. And then we'll call a function called handle click. You might want to have something more descriptive than that. I find in the JavaScript world, they do a lot of that kind of naming convention. I don't really love it, but it works, I guess. All right, so that gives us the basis of the UI, and our underlying logic will need to hook into our stimulus controller. Let's go ahead and generate the stimulus controller next. So I'll do that honestly from the command line, which is pretty nifty. We could say Rails generate stimulus, and we'll call this one geolocation. And what it'll do is go and create that file, but it'll also update our manifest, which essentially does a few things. If you go in the JavaScript folder in the index page, you'll see it adds it for you, which is handy. Typing this over and over, which I did in the very beginning before I realized there was a generator for it, was a painstaking process, but not the end of the world. So this really cleans that up and makes it a lot quicker to do. With this invoked, we've got this controller now, so that could very well work. So if we want to check that, we could say just log it works and load the page. If we go to inspect, with any luck, we should see that output. Very good. All right. In this specific case, we want to have our, if you recall, we had a target. So let's add a target. We'll call this static targets and insert that input, which we called here, if you recall. And that gives us that, connection to it, essentially. In the connect method, this is going to fire essentially when this is found on the page, this controller. If you remove this code won't work at all. So you have to remember to keep that in place. Make sure there's something there. We're not going to actually use the connect method in this specific case because all this is going to happen on the click event. So we can actually remove it. I just wanted to demonstrate it was working. So what we'll pay attention to is that handle click method. And inside of that, we're going to look for Navigator API, which is part of the browser. And then we're going to say geolocation, which is part of that specific API. Then we could take the navigator.getCurrentPosition and then use that method. If you recall in the docs here, there's a getCurrentPosition, which has a success, error, and options parameters. So success does something on success, error does something on the error, and yada, yada, yada. So it's pretty straightforward there. So when you call this getCurrentPosition, we're going to pass in a couple functions one's going to be for the success state, one's going to be for the error state, and then we won't actually pass any options in that case. So I'll define other methods that do this so we can keep it kind of simplified. But when you do this, you want to make sure, because it's in the context of this method, we need to bind this to it. So the bind this. And then we'll do the same for handle error. Then those methods we need to define inside the class right here. So you can do that just by creating the method. Might be good to do error checking here. So if there's no navigation or navigator geolocation, you can do some sort of error state and log that out. Remove that, and you can say else console.error. That will help you debug, essentially. Geolocation is not supported by this browser. Very good. All right, and then underneath that, we'll have the handle success. Just define that. It's going to take in a position, which is what we're binding in this specific case. So make sure you spell it right. I'm going to do one that says handle error as well. That'll actually take in the error state, and we'll do one more method where it's just going to be verbatim send location to Rails. It's our own internal private method that does what we're looking for. So in this case, we'll say latitude is what we're going to send through, and longitude. The API in the browser is able to, uncover those things. But before we do all that, let's go back up and handle success. So this will essentially do destructuring of latitude and longitude. And we're going to set that equal to position coords, which is what we're passing through. That will give us the ability to send those 2 data points through to our send location to Rails. So let's do that. We'll just call that essentially right here, send location to Rails, latitude, and then longitude. Very good. And on the error state, we'll just do another console.error. It's just extracting this away to keep it cleaner. And we'll say geolocation error, and we can just pipe that message through. In our case, I'm going to use backtick message. All right, cool. So in this specific case, now we do essentially a request via JavaScript to the server. There is maybe a way you could do this with Turbo. I tried to go down that path where you didn't need to write JavaScript, but the Navigator API doesn't really make that possible. So I ended up having to use Stimulus, which in this specific case, I think makes sense. But a lot of times you might not need JavaScript. So something to keep in mind. For Rails, because we're going to make a request to the server, we need to tap into the cross-site forgery token that's in your app. If you've ever booted an app and you look into your source, go up in the meta tags and you should see that right there. Now that's dynamic and gets readjusted every page load essentially. So it gives you a way to have authenticity when you're doing something like this. Good security thing. So we'll actually go and fetch that from the DOM. You could put a target on it if you want to make this a global thing. I don't think it's necessary in this case. So meta, and we'll say CS name equals CSRF token, and get the content from it. Oops, just content. There we go. That will give us the ability to do a fetch request, which is going to come next. And this is going to be async kind of thing. So we'll do search location, which is that endpoint we added. Then pass in options. So within that scope, we'll make sure it's a post method since we define that in our routes, if you recall. And we'll pass in the headers since we were using that cross-site forgery setup. And it's going to be expect a JSON response. So we'll say content type application JSON, and then we'll also pass in that header CRF token. That's going to be what we just defined, CSRF token. And then finally, the body of the response will pass JSON.stringify. Again, latitude, longitude. Cool. All right, then we can say response. I'll do if the response is not okay. We'll throw a new error. And just call it what it is. So HTTP error status equals response.status. Gives you a look into what's wrong. And if that happens, that will happen first and kind of break the mold here. Otherwise, we'll return the response.json. Okay, and then do one more then. We can tap into that data that gets returned from our server. And what I did, just to kind of keep it simple for our purposes, I'm just going to say if data.state exists, we will set the input target, which is, again, if you recall, our target right here. I think that should be targets, by the way. So input target.value will be data.state. Essentially sets the field to have that. We could say also else if there's a city, this.input target.value equals data.city. You could essentially expose the person's literal address if you have the coordinates. So it's kind of nice in that way, but also kind of scary. So if nothing works here, we'll still console error. And we'll just say error communicating with Rails app. And we can pass in the error. Oh. All right. So hopefully, with any luck, this should work. Need to spell things correctly here. So I just see that is misspelled. I'll just copy and paste it down here. So here's essentially what's happening. If we go in, we handle our click event, which if you recall is on this button element. We're clicking, calling our controller, which is going into their stimulus controller and looking for that function. That function's here. And then we're checking if the current browser, whoever's clicking, has the navigator API and geolocation specifically. If they do, we'll go ahead and pipe that through the getCurrentPosition. That's going to go and have a success and error argument. And if there's a success, we'll destructure the longitude and latitude out of the position itself. There's more to that position if you want to extract more. Then we'll send that data down to our send location Rails method, which is essentially going to do a post request to our server, spit back data, which we've yet to code. And that response is going to be essentially a JSON that gets input into our field here. All that to do that. But it's dynamic and pretty fancy, so I like it. And let's go to our final step here in our SearchLocationController. We're going to actually access, I'm going to comment lat and longe params set from front end. So these will be params that come through. So latitude, much like you would do on a basic Rails form. Longitude. All right, and from there we can just do the, logic, which would be, in our case, we'll say location data equals Geocoder. We're going to just search based on those coordinates, and you can pass in an array. So in our case, we'll do latitude first, longitude, and we'll render JSON as a response. So we'll say render JSON, and then just say location data first data. It's kind of confusing, but if you look into what returns in the geocode search function, that's kind of what comes back. So you got to go a little deeper on that object and find the first one that's there and get the data from it. So it's like a deep nested thing. All right, let's try it out. So with any luck, we'll see if it works. We got an error, so something's up. We cannot read chords. I think I misspelled something here. I think what I've messed up here is I have these parentheses. I'm going to go ahead and remove those so we can bind it directly. I think something was off with that, so I'm going to try it again. Still not getting it. Get current position. Okay, I spelled geocode wrong, so it should be geocoder. Again, I apologize. I'm terrible at spelling, apparently. Click that again. Let's try it. all goes well, it should input our state into the field. Looks like something's not working though. Okay, looking back at my notes, I had typos, and what ultimately happened is I was returning data.state and not data.address.state. So there was additional data that was there that I couldn't figure out, and then I had to go back and understand what I was doing wrong. I don't know why I had it in my notes that, it was one way and not the other. So essentially, you can return the address in that additional data string. So if we were to click this now, we can get the data and have the address string, and then also go deeper into get the state that returns a state into our view here. One additional thing you might consider doing, since that you notice it took a while, is have some sort of loading state here. So in our case, we could say, if there's a response, we could, trigger something in the field to go a certain way, make it disabled or something like that. I won't go into that much detail because it's pretty straightforward. You like add a class or remove a class based on those events. But that's essentially it. So hopefully that was useful. We got pretty far with just the basic stimulus controller hooking into what's already built into your browser API in that get current position. And we'll just post to our server and use our Geocoder gem to search based on latitude, longitude from the browser and return that JSON back. That gives us the ability to, manipulate the form, update the state, or update the app based on what you need in a given context. So pretty powerful stuff with a little bit of code. So I'm pretty excited about this. Again, I was using this in a side project recently, and I just wanted to share the wealth in my process of doing so. So as a reminder, please like and subscribe to the video. It would mean a lot if you did. I want to try to grow this channel this year, and it is a ton of work to do. So any little bit of help you can give me, I would appreciate it. That's all for now. This video is probably one of many to come. So keep on keeping on, and I'll see you in the next one.